thank you guys so much for letting me do this today. I know I've got some teachers in my family, so I know you've got a lot to go through, a lot you've got to do in a day, so I'll try not to take too much of your time. I do want to give a disclosure. There were some technical difficulties yesterday getting everything set up, so I'm actually teleworking from home. I didn't want you thinking we just play guitar every day when we're not doing this with everything in the background. That's what that is. Not wasting your taxpayer dollars in a band or anything like that. So, but I want to thank you so much for letting me do this. Let me go ahead and get my presentation set up here for you guys. Okay. So again, my name's Ranger Barber or Natalie, either one. But welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Birthplace. And again, thank you for letting me do this today. We are located in Hodgenville, Kentucky, less than an hour outside of Louisville. So we're about 45 minutes south of there. And this is where on February 12th, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born. And about 90% of our visitors do think that, but he was actually born here in Hodgenville, Kentucky. We actually have 3 separate units at our site. Just give you a little bit about the park so you know what it is we have here. There's the main birthplace in the upper left-hand corner with that couple coming down the steps. That's actually the hill where the memorial's sitting up there is where Abraham Lincoln was born. We have a picnic area across the street with hiking trails that actually used to be part of the original Lincoln property. And Knob Creek, where Abraham lived from the age of 2 to 7, and where his first memories actually did take place. When he referenced the farm in Kentucky as president, that is the farm he was talking about. So down there in the bottom, the picture in the middle, that's the Knob Creek farm. Now, at the birthplace, we have a memorial, the first Lincoln Memorial building in America. It predates the one in D.C., and it houses an old cabin that represents the kind of home that Abraham was born in. And we also have a spring where water runs out. That's where Lincoln would have had his first drink of water as a baby. It's actually still running today, which is kind of cool. It's like the Lincolns just kind of left the tap on there for you. And an enormous boundary oak tree that survived from Lincoln's time. It was about 20 years old when Abraham was born on that hill until 1976, when disease finally took it. And we've marked the spot in the park where it used to sit, and we took a huge slice from the tree when it was cut down, and that is on display inside of our museum. Our visitor center, we have a short film that talks about the Lincolns in Kentucky, a museum where we talk about, again, the Kentucky experience in Lincoln's life, what it was like when he lived here, and a free junior ranger program for kids so that they can earn a badge. I know it's designed for kids, but we have adults do it as well. It just kind of gets you to engage the park a little bit, and you can earn a badge. There are over 400 in the National Park Service that you can earn. Lincoln logs for kids to play with. In the summer, we have guided tours, hands-on programs like a clay pottery station, historic candle making where we give away candles made on the farm, spinning and crochet lessons. So a good bit going on there in the summer. Knob Creek is a really neat site. That's what we're currently working on getting 100% online. There is an old cabin, Civil War era, but it's a textbook representation of what a frontier cabin did look like in Lincoln's day. 1 room, 1 door, 1 window, 111. And a creek that supplied the family with water where supposedly Lincoln's best friend saved his life as a little boy when they were playing in it. We also have a field, that big field up there at the top, that is undeveloped. That's where Lincoln's first memories took place. Now, obviously, the foliage is going to be a little bit different from when he was there, but that landscape that you see there, you're looking at his first memories. There's also a 3-mile round-trip trail that takes you up to the top of the hill where you can see the whole valley. That's there on the side. And you're seeing it much the way he would have as a child. And there's an old tavern that I don't have pictured here, but that's going to get turned into a museum later this year. Actually, this week, we're working on exhibit designs for that. So that'll be really neat when that's done. Hopefully by 2020, that'll all be up and going. But if you're ever coming through Kentucky or you're on I-65 or anything like that, it's a great place to stop. We are a free park. There are only 2 parks in the entire National Park Service where it is mandated they can never charge money to enter, and we are one of them. Cuyahoga is another, but we're actually never allowed to charge, so everything in our park is free. So tell your parents, come to our site. But why we're here today, right? The story itself. Now, Thomas and Nancy, those are pictured there. They actually weren't that far apart in age. The picture of the man there, Thomas Lincoln, taken towards the end of his life. Picture there of Nancy Hanks, Abraham's mother. We don't know that that's what she looked like. An artist took eyewitness accounts of Nancy along with Abraham's features and guessed as to what she looked like. But they were only actually about 4 years apart, but Nancy died when she was young. She's about 34 years old when she passed from disease. So that's just giving you an idea of what she looks like. But they were both brought to Kentucky as children in the late 1700s by their parents, by Abraham's grandparents. Their families were moving with the American frontier as it spread west, all hoping for a better life and the chance to own their own land. During this time in America, and this is really key, you were not considered fully free unless you owned property. If you worked on someone else's land as a tenant farmer or you received wages for doing work for someone else, you were not allowed to vote or participate in politics in any way. It was believed that because you didn't own land, you weren't able to realize your full potential, and you were therefore not capable of governing yourself. So you weren't allowed to engage in politics. Just as an example, when George Washington was elected president the second time by the public, only 6% of the population could vote. Most white men couldn't even vote, and only 1.3% of the population even turned out to vote. So voting was a big deal, and not everyone could do it. You had to be a white male who did own land, and most people didn't back then. Again, it wasn't believed you could govern yourself. So the frontier, with all the land that they viewed as being unused and open for the taking, offered the possibility to a lot of people for the first time in their lives to be fully free and independent. This was the dream of the founders. When the founding fathers envisioned the republic, they saw a country in which every family owned their own farm as yeoman farmers, and they answered to no one. If you were a yeoman farmer, your boss was essentially the weather. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. So everyone just kind of governed their own lives in their own house. You didn't buy your house, you built it. You didn't buy your food, you grew it. You didn't buy your clothes, you made them. Everything on your own farm was owned by the family and made by the family, and that is what made you free and independent, because you were independent from anyone telling you what to do. That's why landowners could vote. There was, to us today, an obvious problem with this idea of wide open land that no one lived on it. People did live on it. The Shawnee, they actually considered Kentucky and the entire Ohio River Valley area their sacred land. And the violence between the thousands of settlers pouring over the mountains hoping for a better life, and the Shawnee, who saw it as their sacred ground, was absolutely vicious. It was beyond just the kind of violence it was like Quentin Tarantino level violence. And settlers at this time lived in forts for protection and cleared land when they thought it was safe to do so, and at times lost everything as a result because their land would get burned by the Shawnee in the night, or they would be attacked while farming their land. And when Thomas was a little boy living in a fort with his parents, his brothers, his sisters, he and his brothers were helping their dad, Captain Abraham, clear land outside the fort. They didn't see the Shawnee raiding party that was passing through the tree line. And one of the Shawnee shot and killed Captain Abraham, Thomas's father, and who our Abraham would be named after later. The oldest son, Mordecai, told his brother Josiah to go get the men from the fort, and told Thomas, who was probably about 6 years old at the time, to stay with their father's body. The Shawnee came running out of the tree line, going for Captain Abraham and possibly to kidnap or kill Thomas, when Mordecai grabbed his father's rifle, pointed it at a medallion that was on a necklace on the Shawnee's chest, and shot for the medallion. One shot, one kill. Took him out and inherited everything, but saved Thomas's life in the process. Thomas was raised by his mother, Bathsheba, and he became a skilled carpenter. But what he really wants is land. That's what everyone wanted. Remember, working for wages didn't make you free. Working for yourself did. And so he married Nancy Hanks. They had a little girl named Sarah. And then Thomas moves them to a rural area where he purchases the Sinking Spring Farm. And there, on the cold morning of February 12th, 1809, Abraham Lincoln is born. And they spend 2 years there as Abraham learns to toddle around and babble nonsense, just like any other little 2-year-old. And during a land dispute over who really owned the lands, the Lincolns moved 10 miles up the road to a small 30-acre patch surrounded by high forested hills, bordered on 2 sides by a creek. In other words, a kid's paradise, right? Abraham would have loved growing up there. And it's here at Knob Creek that he attends a one-room schoolhouse with his sister. They were called blab schools. So on the frontier, you didn't have anything to write with, and you didn't have anything to write on. So you had to literally just memorize all of your lessons and recite them on command when the teacher tells you to, usually all at once. So if you were walking by on the road as the kids were reciting their lessons, it just sounded like blabbing. So they called them blab schools. And so we do have a film that talks about Lincoln going to school for 2 years. It's actually not correct. If you took all of this formal education, which all Abraham ever went to were blab schools, and if you took all of these blab schools and you combine them together to get as much time out of them as you can, you would get about 9 to 10 months of formal education for Abraham. His entire schooling was less than 1 year, so he was largely self-taught. It was his own personal curiosity that drove him. While he's at Knob Creek, he loses a baby brother, Thomas Jr., and that little boy was buried about a mile from home. And while he's at Knob Creek, and this is something that I always emphasize with visitors, the family's church actually split up over the issue of slavery. And this happened all over early Kentucky. There would be contention about whether or not to allow slave owners as members. Thomas and Nancy's church broke up over this issue, and Thomas and Nancy joined the anti-slavery side. They went off and formed their own church. They are the second generation of Lincolns to do this. Captain Abraham and Bathsheba attended a church that also broke up over slavery, and they went with the anti-slavery side. So there was already a thread of this in the Lincoln family before Abraham was even born. As land issues pushed the Lincolns into Indiana and Illinois, Lincoln is exposed to hard work and a really hard life. Splitting thousands of logs, loses his sister when she's giving birth in Indiana, loses his mother to milk sickness. She drinks toxic milk, and she dies young from that. He engages in wrestling. He's actually the only U.S. president who is in the Hall of Fame for wrestling. He was known as a great fighter. Horse racing, he engages in a duel in Illinois. He becomes known for being a great storyteller, which actually on the frontier got you a lot of status. If you could tell a good story, people tended to respect you, and he told great stories. But he's also reading Shakespeare, Byron, Burns, writing his own poetry. If he hears about a book he hasn't read, he'll walk as far as 6 miles one way just to borrow that book so he can read it. He didn't read extensively. On the East Coast, where you had more established institutions, you had libraries and universities, and people could access all kinds of literature. So he didn't read extensively on the frontier. He read intensively. He would read the same books over and over and over and play with the language in his mind, and really became a master of language that way. He applied the hard work ethic that he learned on the farm to bettering his own mind. So he is becoming what the founding fathers envisioned as the ideal American citizen, a free yeoman's son, working hard and making every effort to improve his station in life. He's a testament to really the possibility in America. In Illinois, he doesn't go to law school to be a lawyer. That's one of the number one questions we get at our park. Where did Abraham go to law school? He didn't. You didn't have to. He simply borrowed books from a friend who was a lawyer, studied them, took the bar exam, and passed it, and became a lawyer. After that, however well you did was directly connected to how hard you worked, and he worked extremely hard. If you look at the pictures on that slide, the one at the top in the middle, that's an illustration of him riding the circuit. So on the frontier, all these little villages scattered around the frontier didn't really all have courts, right? So in the spring and the fall, around the planting and the harvest, a judge would get on a horse, and a bunch of lawyers, whoever wanted to go, would get on horses behind him, and they just ride around and set up little courts in these villages. It's called riding the circuit. Not everyone did it, and if they did it a little bit here and there, but you've got families. You don't want to be around your family that long. But Abraham rode it relentlessly. He was known for his work ethic. Every time there was a circuit, he was there. Anyone who needed their case taken, he would take it, any case that hit his desk. So a very hard worker. He passed from a yeoman's son with less than a year of education to one of the greatest legislators in Illinois history, and then on to the presidency. And that's key. There are some people who make the argument that, well, if Lincoln wouldn't have become president, no one ever would have known about him. And that's not exactly correct. Even if he hadn't become president, he would have gone down in history as one of the greatest legislators in Illinois history. If you needed a bill passed, Lincoln's the guy that you got to write it. Very intelligent man. He dealt honestly and fairly with people. They liked him. So when the time came to run for president, they campaigned for him. And it wasn't just friends campaigning for him. It was friends from opposite parties. They weren't even part of his party, and they would still campaign on his behalf because they liked him so much. Part of why Lincoln is remembered as such a great president is specifically because of where he started in comparison to where he ended in life. And that brings us to his legacy insofar as it relates to the memorial at our park. In 1895, long as about 30 years after Lincoln was assassinated, a couple of businessmen tried to make some money off of the memory of Lincoln. They bought the farm where he was born, purchased a nearby cabin, and told everyone it was Lincoln's cabin. That was their way to kind of try and make a buck. And if you look at the lower picture there in the corner with those two guys on bicycles, it's one of the earliest photographs. Actually, it's the earliest photograph we can find of the farm. And way off in the corner behind the tree, you can see a little cabin, and that's where they set it up for people to come look at it. But that's looks very different today, but that's what the earliest image of what it looks like then. But they traveled the cabin around the country. They put it on display. They rented it out to be displayed at different carnivals. Took it on a bit of a carnival circuit. At one point, they think it was actually at Coney Island up near Atlantic City. So it's interesting. It's interesting that they were trying to make a buck off of his memory like that, but this is what preservation was like in the early 1900s. It was a bit of a circus. Eventually, the IRS became very interested in the funds of these two businessmen, and they stored the logs from the Lincoln cabin in the basement of a New York mansion in order to hide them from the government. Around this time, two editors from Collier's Weekly, a big-time magazine for the time, Robert Collier and Richard Lloyd Jones, kind of the Time magazine of their day, really, they genuinely cared about Lincoln, and they wanted to memorialize him. They wanted to save the farm from being exploited the way that the cabin was being exploited. They wanted it to be saved from unwholesome popularity and vulgarity. So they wanted to actually create a national park. And that's an interesting point, because the National Park Service didn't even exist yet, but they had this idea of a national park. And they opened it up to the public. They created the Lincoln Farm Association, and they said that anyone in the world can give between 25 cents and $25, and they'll become part of the Lincoln Farm Association. They'll receive a certificate up there at the top, and that money the money that they gave will go towards building the memorial. Some of the most powerful people in America at that time, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, William Jennings Bryan, Mark Twain, all gave money. But most of the money, interestingly enough, came from school kids. They gave an average of 31 cents, and eventually the Lincoln Farm Association collected over $300,000 to build this memorial. The cabin that was traveled around the country was brought down to Kentucky on a train draped in American flags. Down there at the bottom, you can see some soldiers standing there with the logs. Made a bit of a show out of that trip, but I think that's kind of neat. And it made its way to the memorial, where it's currently sat for well over that picture of it down there at the bottom in the other corner is one of the first images that we have of the memorial. The fact that a cabin, though, a lot of people compare our memorial to the one in D.C. Ours came first. Nothing against the one in D.C. It's beautiful. But that one has a statue of Lincoln. It is specifically about Lincoln. The key to his legacy here, as it's preserved at our park, is that it's not a statue. It is a cabin, right? And that's an important distinction. The Lincoln Farm Association was not just enshrining an old house, but an idea. 90% of America that was living out on the frontier lived in a home just like Lincoln was born in. That cabin could have been anyone's, and that was the whole point. The memorial was designed to celebrate Lincoln's humble beginnings, as evidence for what's actually possible in a democracy. And remember, all of this was taking place in the early 1900s. So America was really just emerging as a world power, and we were finally, as a very young country, collecting a history that we could be proud of, that could maybe compete with other countries' histories. Where did leaders from the rest of the world come from at this time? Among the countries of the world that we were going to be competing with, less than a dozen forms of democracy existed. Most of the great leaders around the world got to where they were because of their family's name or wealth. You were who you were. You sat where you sat because of who your dad was. The Lincoln Farm Association, with this memorial, was actually saying, well, look what we can do. In a democratic republic, you can come from a one-room cabin in the wildest part of the country, and with less than a year of education, become the president of the United States. You can make it to the White House. A large part of Lincoln's legacy is his beginning, because it stands in stark contrast to where he ended up. Just as the cabin stands in stark contrast to the memorial itself, his life stands as proof that what the founding fathers envisioned for Americans was actually possible to achieve. He is the very embodiment of the American dream, and that's the legacy as it's preserved at our park. So with that being said, let me go back here. Do you guys have any questions at all about anything that was just talked about, the park, Lincoln himself, 19th century history, anything like that? Ooh.
Why don't we go upstairs?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I see a hand up.
Was his brother buried with him right next to his wife as well?
Yeah, so Lincoln, when they lived in Knob Creek, they actually didn't own it, so they did not have the rights to bury Lincoln's brother there. So he was buried about a mile from the property on a friend of the family's family cemetery, and it's currently private property today, so the rangers at the park haven't been to it either. There are pictures on Google. The headstone was discovered in the 1930s and donated to the Park Service, and the Boy Scouts funded a much nicer headstone that sits there today, but still on private property. So the only immediate family member buried in Kentucky today is Abraham Lincoln's little brother. Yeah. Yeah, I see another hand up.
So when they were all buried, did they all get buried spread apart from each other?
Yeah, actually, for the most part. Thomas Jr., again, Lincoln's little brother's in Kentucky. In Indiana, there is a national park site for their time in Indiana where they lived for 15 years. And Abraham's mother and sister are buried there. Everyone else is buried up in Illinois. Yeah, so they are spread out. Good question. I might have a question for you guys. So the emphasis as far as Lincoln and the memorial representing the American, I'm always interested talking to kids, well, actually all visitors, because that term gets thrown around. It's a little bit generic, right? The American dream. And what's actually happening in your head, it's going to be different for everyone. It's going to mean something different for everyone else. So I'm just curious, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if you wouldn't mind, I would like to know, what does that mean to you guys? When I say the American dream, what popped up in your head?
What does it mean too?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it mean like being rich?
Being rich? Okay. All right. I think it's probably true for a lot of people. Yeah, go ahead.
Having peace.
Having peace. I like that. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Having wealth and land.
Okay. Good stuff. Yeah. So it kind of spans a little bit of spectrum there as far as material wealth or peace. It's always kind of interesting to me how we do that. And we get at the park, we get about 200,000 visitors a year from all people this week from China, Mongolia, France, Belgium, and it's always interesting globally how people from all over the world understand the American dream. I think that's That's always been kind of a changing term throughout our history, but it's very interesting to see how people feel about that. What do you think about today? If Lincoln were born today, do you think he would be possible?
Person? Anybody else? Let's get somebody else before.
What was the second question? Part of it, like what?
Do you think he would be president? Or do you think he would be?
Yeah, could he do what he did then today?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
I
No.
think
so.
We got some no's.
What?
What kind of obstacles would prevent him from getting to where he ended up in his own time? Yeah, go ahead.
How many times he failed in his past. I think the Americans nowadays would see that as a bad critiquing of him, going down and down instead of coming up, like how we saw it in the older days.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
There's a bigger population, so a lot of other people can have different ideas and not go with President Lincoln.
That's a really an excellent point. Yeah, that where he was in the Ohio River Valley at that time was so unformed. There were all kinds of ways to kind of make your own path. And today it is a little bit more. There are so many more people. Everything is so much more concretely defined as how you get from point A to point B. So that's a really interesting point. Anyone think he would be possible? That he could? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I think he would, because like who he was he seems like a nice guy. Like I think he has a possibility of becoming president.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I think he could because of how many times he retried, and even though he failed, he kept retrying to see if he could make himself better.
That's true. Yeah, his persistence was pretty incredible. When you look at, like it was mentioned, how many times he did fail at things, he never stopped. He was very good at seeing an opportunity within a failure. Yeah, I see a hand up. Go ahead.
I think he will, because even though he didn't have that much wealth and he didn't live in the White House, he lived in a good farm and a good cabin that kept him warm. But I think all the good things that he did for the people, I mean, he pretty much sacrificed himself.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a very good point. And I like that you bring that up. A lot of people that come to the site, see the cabin and think, oh, that's what a terrible life. They were so poor. It's like, no, that's how most people live. The cabin did what it was supposed to do. That was considered a good life back then. And at one of the slides that I put up, it showed people on the frontier, and this is kind of key. And it's easy to miss today, but you really hit the nail on the head there with it. All those people standing in front of cabins and sod houses out on the prairies, and there was one picture I meant to put it. I need to go back and see if I did actually put it up there. It's a family and the kids are barefoot and there's a goat on the roof, and you look at it and it's like, that's rough. But back then, photographs were very expensive, and these people that looked like they were poor to us were extremely proud of their situation. They were surviving, right? That the houses did their jobs, and they were more concerned really with land so much than the condition of the house and if it was beautiful or not. You wouldn't be spending much time in a house on a frontier. You'd be spending most of your time outside. So that's an excellent point. But it is kind of fun to think about whether or not Lincoln, any historical figure, what obstacles they would have today that they wouldn't have had back then. And my mind does typically tend to go back to population, the sheer amount of people today. That was a really good point. So, do you guys have any of your own questions or thoughts on it, or? You're a bright group, so your teachers are doing a good job. Right? And nothing that I said may be confusing, or yeah, go ahead.
So people that look like they may have been poor were actually had a good job and were pretty wealthy with their money and stuff.
Well, and it wasn't even so much cash, really. Now, Thomas Lincoln did. It appears that, based on the evidence, that he did have enough cash on hand for the family. But, and this is one of the things that trips up people at our site. Our film states that the Lincolns were middle class. They were actually one of the top 15% of taxpayers in their area here in Kentucky. Very small population that you're looking with. It was out of 98 people or 98 families. They were in the top 15%. But middle class today doesn't have anything to do with middle class in Lincoln's time. Today it implies purchase power. Middle class is the kind of car you buy, the kind of house you buy, the kind of clothes you buy. Where do you do your grocery shopping? For people on the frontier, you built your house, you grew your food, you hunted your food, you made your clothes. Your family was the economy. So it has a very different meaning, but as long as you had land, it was understood you were good. Whatever you needed, you could create and build and grow on your own. Yeah, go ahead.
What was the typical amount of land people owned?
Well, when people were coming over the mountains to settle here, it was right after the Revolutionary War, and it was as payment for service in the Revolution. And so it all depended on what your rank had been. Typically, you're looking at people averaged anywhere from about 250 to maybe 400 acres. It was pretty typical. So when they were at Knob Creek, it was a 230-acre area of land. But the Lincolns were only farming 30 acres of it. So it looked like they were renting that amount of property. But all of the farms that they owned outside of that time period, it was generally about 200 to 300 acres that you would have. Because you didn't just need food. You had to have land for food. You needed trees as well, because you had to have firewood. That's how you're going to do your cooking. That's how you're going to stay warm when it's cold. So you were constantly having to use trees as well. So even though you might read that someone had 300 acres, doesn't mean they were farming the 300 acres. It was just that much land was at their disposal, however they chose to use it. But if you were an officer or a planter, the planter class certainly lived differently. You're looking at thousands upon thousands, huge swaths of land. And that was one of the things in early Kentucky when people were coming over here. It was yeoman farmers trying to grab that 300 acres before the Virginia planters came over and started taking up thousands of acres where no one had room to buy anything. Yeah, go ahead.
Did Abraham Lincoln invent anything?
He did. He has a patent. I think he's the only president that has a patent, as well as being the only one in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. But yeah, he came up with an idea for a flatboat that could fill up with air to help flatboats get up over places in the river where they might get stuck. And he got that patent. I don't know that it was ever actually built, but he got the patent. So yeah, his mind was always going. Was that a hand up? No? Okay. All right. Anything else?
Yes? Something about Lincoln or?
Yeah.
Was it actually true that when he cut down the cherry tree, he actually... Never mind.
That's okay. Actually, you're not the only person to ask that. I've had visitors ask that as well. It is actually George Washington. And as far as we know, it's just a story. It's just kind of a myth to kind of emphasize the honesty of Washington.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Have you guys, any of you guys ever been to Kentucky? Oh, you got one? Did you guys stop the park?
Did you stop at the park?
No, I didn't stop at the park.
Okay, no worries. Well, you've got Lincoln sites all over Kentucky, and actually, when you do get more into the Civil War and Lincoln's time period, during that very convulsive moment in American history, Kentucky offers not just a little bit of history on Lincoln. Mary Todd, his wife, is actually from Lexington, which is about an hour and a half from our park. So she was from Kentucky. His ambassador to Russia was actually freeing serfs while America was freeing slaves, right around that same time. So his ambassador to Russia, Cassius Clay, who the boxer is inadvertently is actually from Kentucky. You can go to his house, and he was crazy. His tours are always fun to go on because he was just such a crazy historical figure. Got in all kinds of duels, put cannons in the windows of his house, got in a knife fight, and it was just awesome. But yeah, I see a hand up. Go ahead.
Was he ever related to someone else famous?
Yes, actually, he was. There are several descendants. So through his mother, his mother's name was Nancy Hanks. And can you guys think of a famous person with the name Hanks? Oh, you know, I saw that. Yep, go ahead. That's right. Actually, Tom Hanks is related through his mother's side, as is George Clooney. George Clooney is actually born in Kentucky, and through the Hanks line, he's related to Abraham Lincoln. And Tennessee Williams is related. You have John Hancock is actually related as kind of a distant cousin. Other Lincolns that did not follow the frontier over the Appalachian Mountains, because the Lincoln family came in through Massachusetts, and those Lincolns, the ones that stayed, did really well. One of them was an attorney general to Thomas Jefferson. Another one, 20 years old, was involved in the Boston Tea Party, throwing the tea into the river, ended up marrying a daughter of Paul Revere. She died. He married another daughter of Paul Revere. So you had Lincolns kind of popping up on the scene long before Abraham, and continued. There are Lincolns that have continued to do well. Both Bushes, George Bush, H.W. and W. are related. So the Lincoln line has done well. Absolutely. Good quick. But I will tell you, the last direct descendant from Abraham Lincoln died in 1985. So if anyone says they're directly related to Abraham, last one died in 1985. The only way people can be related is through either his mother's line or aunts and uncles. That's it. So. Anything else? Let me ask. Go ahead.
Has he traveled to any other states?
You mean when he was president? Did he go to other states, or just as far as the states he lived in?
Like ever since he was little, growing up, has he traveled to any other states as he was growing up?
No, he went straight from Kentucky to Indiana and then to Illinois. He did, while he was in Illinois, he was in the Black Hawk War. He was elected captain of his militia. The thing that he was most proud of, even as president, he said the moment he was most proud of is when his fellow villagers elected him to be the captain of the militia, because he looked the best on a horse. He was 6'4", so tall guys typically do get that kind of prestige. But I do believe that they went up into out of Illinois. I forget which state. It was 400 miles from his village where he was finally discharged, and walked all the way back. As a flatboatman, he took a flatboat twice down the Mississippi River, before president, obviously, to New Orleans to deliver goods for a store owner. So twice he took a flatboat down the Mississippi. We don't know how he got back. Some books that you read will say he took a steamboat back. There's no evidence for that. Some will say he walked back on the Natchez Trace. It's possible, but there's no evidence for that either. But he'd have seen a lot of the country taking that flatboat down the Mississippi. He was exposed to quite a bit, and the harsher realities of slavery as well, because there was slavery in Kentucky. There was not in Indiana or Illinois, even though they had extremely racist laws towards freedmen. But he saw the harshest realities of slavery when he took that flatboat down to New Orleans and saw the slave markets down there. The further south you went, typically the harsher the slavery got, because they were being used for large agricultural production down there. So he did do a good bit of travel on that. Yeah.
Right.
Who assassinated him?
John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead and explain.
What's that?
You can go ahead and explain.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So John Wilkes Booth was an actor at the time. a very famous actor. The equivalent today would be like someone like Chris Hemsworth or Brad Pitt or George Clooney, just someone considered very famous. He was considered the most handsome man in America. By today's standards, that might not fly, but but back then he was the handsomest man in America, extremely well known, very much pro-Confederate. And the plan had always been to kidnap Abraham Lincoln and take him down to the Deep South and exchange him for Confederate soldiers so that the tide of the war would change in favor of the Confederacy. And that never worked. It didn't pan out. And then when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, which is also a national park site, that was a big signal that the Army of Northern Virginia, General Lee, surrendered. Even though the war wasn't technically over, the end was clearly on the horizon. And that was it for John Wilkes Booth. Something just, it really kind of snapped for him. And he was actually attending Lincoln's last speech. The last speech Lincoln ever made was April 11th from the window of the White House. He just opened the window and gave a speech, and people gathered around. And while he was giving the speech, he mentioned extending the vote to black men, and that was too much for John Wilkes Booth. Again, the plan had always been to kidnap, but when he heard that Lincoln wanted certain black men to get the vote, that was too much for John Wilkes Booth. And he told his fellow conspirator at that moment to shoot Lincoln from the window. His fellow conspirator refused. They were in a crowd of people. He never would have made it out alive. And John Wilkes Booth said he'll do it himself. He said that's the last speech he will ever make. And 3 days later, shot him in Ford's Theater. So that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for John Wilkes Booth. So, and if you ever get the chance, Ford's Theater is a national park site. That is, it's free. You're welcome to go. It is still an active theater. They do have plays, not in the summertime, but from fall all the way through spring, they have plays. And a museum underneath, it has the actual gun that John Wilkes Booth used. It has letters from Lincoln. It has a suit Lincoln was wearing the night he was assassinated. It's a really interesting site. So you can check that out as well. Have any questions about? Yeah, go ahead.
How old is the place where the Lincoln Memorial is?
So the Lincoln, you mean the one in Washington, D.C.?
How old is the building?
Yeah, I think I cut out for a second. So you mean the actual Washington Memorial and
Is that what you're asking? The Lincoln Memorial?
Yeah, how old is the Lincoln Memorial?
yeah, it was finished in 1922. So that's how old that is. So it's not quite 100 years. So it was started in 1914, took about 8 years to build, and it was dedicated in 1922. Hand up down front there.
Do you think the Lincoln Memorial was built with different kinds of marble inside and outside and the pillars. Do you think they'll ever put the exact same marble into that whole building and rebuild it and do only the same marble?
I don't think they will. I mean, there's always a possibility, I guess, but I don't see them doing that specifically. I think that if a repair needs to be made, they may try to go to the same source in order to do the repairs as they're needed. But there was a little bit of infighting over exactly which marble to use in that specific memorial, and that was extremely difficult to get. It would have to match, so they would have to go to the same source, but to rebuild it all at once, economically, I don't think it would be feasible to do. They would have to piecemeal that, and if they were going to just rebuild the whole thing, say there's an earthquake and the whole thing falls apart and they have to rebuild it, they may go to a different source for that marble. But as of right now, say a block came out or a pillar broke, just for that repair, I think they'd likely have to go to the same source to get it. You guys have good questions. You've been a good group. Well, that's it for you guys. That's all I've got.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you guys for letting me do this. Like I said, if you're ever in Kentucky and you're driving down I-65, tell your parents we're a free stop. Our restrooms are always spotless. We're free, so come check us out.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.